Okay, so we're doing the problem of evil, and I guess it's sort of an informal exchange debate type activity that we're doing, where you will be taking the side that the problem of evil has something important, really important to say against theism, whether against its truth or against its plausibility. And I'm going to be basically interrogating the problem to see exactly what it has to say first before I see if theism can adequately answer it. Okay? And so first I would want to basically, we can start out with, do you think that, let me just ask you, do you think that the way Epicurus lays it out, in a very simple, straightforward, propositional form, is that a fair presentation of the problem of evil?
I would say that it is, if someone wants to assert that there is a good God that is not, or I'm sorry, that is supposed to be omnipotent and omniscient. But if it's not a God that knows everything, that has all power, then it is less effective. Or if it's supposed to address whether or not a God might actually be evil, you could make the argument that it argues for an evil God. Right. So it works as far as it's applied to one specific type of deity.
Right. Right. So it's really an objection to classical theism.
Yes, the God of classical monotheism.
Rather than to just any existence of any God whatsoever, even any God worshipped by people, because someone might worship God even though God might not be fully good or not be fully almighty, but still they might think he or she is worthy of honor. And that's like a more religious thing, but it's not a metaphysical proposition that the problem of evil can speak to. But I'm going to be defending the stronger classical theism argument, so it is an argument that the problem of evil at least has a chance to address. At least we're talking about the same thing.
Yes.
Right?
I wish you good luck.
So, and I also think it's a fair, very simple, laid out, proposition where you look at a couple of premises and a conclusion, and as far as it goes, it's it's right there, and it's right in front of you, and it's got an internal strength to its propositional form, and so it has to be faced head on and dealt with, and not just excuses, but really just this is fine, this is fair. What can we say about it? So, was there anything you wanted to say? Because I feel like I've been talking for a while. Is there anything you wanted to say before I said anything else?
Well, I'd like to point out something here, in that the problem of evil only exists for theism. As an atheist, as a non-believer, or if someone would to suggest agnostic, for someone without any belief in God, or who believes there is no God, evil is a problem. But the classical problem of evil does not exist for me, because I am dealing with a blind, indifferent nature that does not care about anyone or anything. It simply is. So I have to deal with the reality that exists on that set of terms. I don't have a problem of evil. The problem of evil specifically applies only to arguing for one specific type of theistic deity. So.
Right, it's in effect the theist's problem. The atheist is presenting the theist with his own problem, in effect.
Yes, it is a problem that comes as a result of a specific worldview, addressed with various degrees of success. And I would argue the best success is still not adequate, but let's see how you do.
Well, yeah, I guess we'll find out. Mm-hmm. I want to, because I'm going to be interrogating the problem. It might sound at times like I'm trying to hem and haw and find excuses, but really I'm just trying to get clarity. Okay? So I would have to ask if you think that the problem of evil is best expressed or exemplified as a way to falsify theism factually, or is it just an attack on theism's coherence?
I wouldn't say that it's an attack on the coherence,
Okay.
except in terms of, how do I phrase this? All right, if you have a deity that is all good and that has a plan for existence, then since we live in a world where evil exists, this deity's plan necessarily involves evil. And that means that this deity cannot be 100% good. You cannot be 100% good and require evil in your plan. That, especially if your deity is also all-powerful, meaning he could have anything the way he wants, meaning he expressly decided that this is the plan.
I see. Wait, so that sounds like it's an objection to theism based on facts. The fact that evil exists.
Yes, the term would, to call a god all good would be contradictory, or paradoxical if you prefer, if you want to say that his plan also requires evil, which, if this god does exist, his plan, if he has one, clearly does. If you know what I mean.
Now the objection to coherence doesn't entail, and you have to start with the one you're taking, but the objection to coherence, which I've had people say to me, use against me, against theism towards me, is one that tries to hold on to a certain strength that they see in the way they do atheism, which is to not be propositionally committed to say objective values, the real existence of objective values, of objective good and objective evil.
Well,
Okay.
could I clarify something here? When we, generally speaking, I don't know if I want to say most, let's just say many, non-believers take a relativistic view of good and evil. But if we're going to talk about what good and evil mean in a definitional sense, then we are going to be dealing with things that are objective. For example, it is objectively bad for your health to drink strychnine. No one would
Right.
argue that that's good for your health. You're not going to continue living. We apply certain general truths. Better to be healthy than sick, better to be alive than dead, better to be happy than sad. These are all general truths that we all live our lives by because we have no other choice. There are exceptions, such as tremendous pain. So just ending that pain would be the greater good. But as a general sort of way, when we're talking about good and evil, we're talking about the objective health, happiness, and well-being of our fellow man, and if you're of that bent, other forms of life and organisms on the planet. So we can talk about it in an objective sense rather than a relativistic sense, if that's okay with you.
That sounds great. Now, I just to get this on the record, there is the reason why many unbelievers prefer a relativistic position is because they don't want to deal with the problem of, like, okay, say theists have a problem of evil. We have to account for evil with a good God. But non-believers might have, by at least some interpretation, by some thought, an opposite side of the coin problem, counting for, real good. Now you're describing good functionally, almost existentially, which is a strong way of doing it.
Thank you.
And doesn't necessarily root value saying something religious, or some kind of, like, some God said, no, not that, do this instead,
Yes.
and that's what good and evil mean. Rather, you're saying, and I think very strongly, that the evil that you're accepting as something that puts theism into a serious problem is not necessarily that kind of good or evil. It's just the you could call it a metaphysical good or evil. Just things are, and there's a way they should be, and in general. And I just want to get on the record that there is probably still some tension there with, say, a naturalistic view, not necessarily the kind of one that would defeat on its surface naturalism, but that there is a certain tension that would be worth exploring, perhaps in another talk, about how what is entailed by this concession of some objective value of some kind. How much, how consistent is this for the naturalistic worldview? But that being on the record, we don't have to go there because it would be a diversion from the problem of evil talk, I think, and I don't want to divert it. I want to face the problem. I want to face it squarely and not distract it with some kind of weird thing about, well, what do you think? Well, how do you account for good? That's not. We're not doing the problem of good. We're doing the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm. The problem of good would be a good subject for another day, though. We should do that sometime.
Mm-hmm. So, having pointed out the tension, so it's on the record, and I would like to hold on, because I made a list of things to say, so I wouldn't be like floundering and have nothing to say, and then make
I do the same thing. I took a couple of just 3 points that I wanted to cover. I flashed them up on the screen real quick, but I just realized, oh yeah, you can't see my screen. So, well, you'll see it in the recording.
Okay. If there was one thing I wanted to say before I shut up for a second, and let you talk again, it would be to also get this on the record, that there is a middle proposition that theists hold that I would contend helped rescue the logic of theism. Now, you're not attacking its logic. You are actually coming at it from it's contrary to facts point of view. But it is worth pointing out a certain logical consistency, which you've already conceded. But that is that theism has an answer to this issue, and that is the classical free will defense, which we could go into, because that is the classical.
Yes, that is. I would argue that the free will defense is probably the strongest answer that theism has to that, and I would like to cover why I believe that is an inadequate answer.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that now, or
sure? I mean, I'm happy to let you go, but if you'd like, I can go over it now.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So, the problem with the free will argument is that it creates a situation where you have a deity whose respect for free will exists only for evil. All right, and I'll give you an example. You have got a pedophile priest of, let's say, the Mormon Church or Jehovah's Witnesses, the ones who've had the most recent series of scandals.
Right.
All right. In the room with a potential victim, and there's two sets of free will there. You have the perpetrator and you have the victim. Now, if a God exists, there's actually three, and that is God's free will, because we're assuming that God is free to act. All right, He can make a choice. He's a sentient agent. So there's three sets of free will: the pedophile, the victim, and the deity. All right. Now, the pedophile, the perpetrator, his free will is different than that of the victim. The pedophile wants to create a victim. The victim doesn't want to be a victim. Right. So when God chooses to respect free will, He's choosing to respect not the free will of the innocent victim, but the free will of the evil agent. He could do one of three clear things. He can do nothing, he can help the victim, or he can help the perpetrator. Helping the perpetrator and doing nothing have identical outcomes. All right. So when God is saying, "I'm going to respect free will," He's choosing to let one set of free will be violated by another. So I think that's a very inadequate answer from a demonstrable perspective. Either way, no matter what God chooses to do, someone's free will is being violated, isn't it? So either you have a God that does nothing and respects the free will of evil, a God that does something to help evil, or a God that helps someone who is innocent, whose free will is being violated.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to give that objection all of the credit it deserves, because I think it's even understated. Because the first defense is that what's being victimized is not a person's will, but a person's body, and a person's desire not to have that body assaulted and victimized horribly. But with the pedophilia objection, which is very strong, it's one of the worst evils you can conceive of, that evil is eventually corrupted just by the fact of being victimized in a certain way.
Could you clarify what you mean by corrupted?
I mean that they're more likely to become offenders in the future.
Mm-hmm.
They're psychologically ruined by such.
Oh, sure, yes. The victims are often grow up to become victimizers.
Right. So, the initial assault isn't really a direct assault on a person's will, but the long-term effects do have a freedom undermining and a freedom corrupting effect that I thought it would be worth stating. And if I tried to get out of it just by saying, well, it's not really his will that's directly victimized, you would have then had to go there. And I just wanted to get that out so we can save some time. We only have a certain number of minutes to do this, at least today.
Yes.
So there are definitely instances where allowing all agents the freedom to act means some will be victimized and will have no power, because more powerful ones will have their way, and that is what is logically entailed. If freedom is respected, sometimes that will happen. Now, let me ask you this: do you think that it is demonstrably certain that let's say that God exists and that God prefers good to evil, before we even have to say whether he's all good or all omnipotent?
Sure.
Let's just say this, hypothetically, if there were a God, do you think that it is demonstrably the case that such a being never acts to prevent one person from doing something bad to another?
Well, I don't think we could show that something never acts, because there are so many cases where we know it hasn't acted, because we have Holocaust after Holocaust, we have genocide after genocide, murder after murder, rape after rape. All of these things happen millions of times per year. Genocide less often than that, but even one time is too often. But we cannot say what would have happened if it did. We can't appraise things that didn't happen. If God aborted somebody who was going to be a genocidal maniac, we'd never know it.
We would never know, right?
Yeah,
so
that's like alternate timeline style stuff.
Right, which are useful for helping to at least figure out what we're trying to say. So,
Yes.
You're saying what you're saying, and I'm
Yeah.
saying what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We're trying to say it as clearly and coherently as we can. So speculations about counterfactuals are sometimes useful to at least figuring out that we're saying something.
We can. I think it's reasonable to say that God did not intervene to say stop any of the murders that happened today, because the murders happened.
So yes, so we know that some things happened that God didn't prevent. We don't know what he did, or what we did prevent. We're incapable of knowing it. Therefore, we're also incapable of ruling it out definitively. Okay. Now, hold on. Let's see. Let me just see for a second. Okay, so now I want to address how the free will defense holds up.
Okay.
Now, let's say we can't rule out that God has, if God existed, let's say, but we can't rule out that he has prevented some things and allowed others. Based on his own decisions of what's best in the long term that we can't even fathom, because we don't see the end from the beginning, and the long term might play out 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years.
Are you arguing for, say, a necessary series of events that would result in a predetermined end state as a result of allowing something to transpire?
Some kind of maximal perfection that has to allow for certain evils to be permitted, because preventing them is incompatible with that maximal good end state.
Okay, and that's a perfectly valid defense as far as it goes, because we as human beings have to make those kinds of sacrifices every day. Generals have to order soldiers onto the field knowing that some of them will die. Nations sometimes have to go to war because if they don't, they'll lose something vital, such as access to water or resources, or a portion of their population is being persecuted and they cannot get them any other way. But we are also finite beings. So
Right.
if this deity is indeed omnipotent, and it is indeed omniscient, even if it sees the end state, it must not have the power to make its plan go any other way, which means you have to sacrifice complete omnipotence. We could redefine a coherent, non-paradoxical deity where this would not be an issue, but it would no longer be the deity of classical monotheism. We are still back to either God is not all good because his plan requires evil and requires the toleration of evil, and required him to create people who would do evil, knowing in advance what they would do, and allowing a degree of suffering that a perfect being wouldn't, or God is just bad, or God is just not there. Now, to me, it's easiest because to me it seems obvious that we live in a fairly godless world. Good acts happen and bad acts happen based on the finite limits of human beings, and genocides happen because of finite evil beings. I just don't see how we can't say that God didn't ever act in any way, but we can see where he failed to act to prevent something that is, from a pragmatic empirical perspective, evil insofar as it impacts human life.
Now, this is one thing that I would like to. Here's something that I want to say about the way the free will defense works, to give it a little bit more plausibility than I think it has on its surface. On its surface, to me, and more likely so to you, it feels like some kind of ad hoc thing where we're trying to, where a theist is trying to rescue the truth of their religious conception from the facts of evil that we see it, and so we throw in this element to give it some kind of more plausibility than it has, to get to sort of buttress it. Now,
I'm inclined to agree with that statement. Yes. Oh, that's a nice painting you have back there. I like the background behind you.
Thanks.
That's neat.
That's actually a picture of Jesus at the well.
Yeah, I thought that looked familiar, and I like the branching pattern you have overhead. Is that an actual vine that you brought in? Not to distract or anything, but I have to compliment that.
I think it's fake. I didn't do it. I'm not the one who decorated the room.
By all means, proceed.
So now, okay, so it feels sort of ad hoc, but our belief in free will didn't just come as a way of rescuing theism. We've sort of always had an idea of rationality, agency, and moral responsibility.
Yes.
So it's sort of, we've had this primitive intuition, true or false. We've had this belief, this notion, and that at every moment of our conscious existence we make choices, and that we're accountable for them. So it's at least as rooted in that as it is in any theodicy that someone has come up with. Now, I want to address how the problem of evil and the free will defense interact in this way.
All right.
So this is going to be kind of an interrogating question. Okay, so let's say that you're saying, okay, problem of evil, man, you got a problem there, theist. And I say, okay, well, I have my free will defense, and you're saying, well, that doesn't really work, because if God is omni this, omni that, omni the other, okay, then you shouldn't have to have evil as a fact. Okay, he should be able to arrange things to get everything that he wants out of his creating the world and creating rational agents without having to allow for any evil. Okay, so first, so I would have to ask: is this sounds like an objection to the presence of any evil, any suffering whatsoever at any time in all of the history of the universe, as a falsifier of theism? Is it that, or is it something more along the lines of it doesn't have to be this evil? Is it about degrees or certain kinds of evil, like moral evil, as opposed to physical stuff?
Well, how shall I phrase this? On the surface, one could go so far as to say that we could apply it to any or all evil, anything bad, or we could even say anything that causes pain. We could go that far. But I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to limit it to simply removing the unthinking elements of nature. For example, asteroid impact. The dinosaurs probably didn't like it very much, but asteroids aren't inherently evil. There's no agency there. Let's limit that focus to what intelligent agents like you and I can do to and or for each other. We just to that degree, we could talk about nature some other time in terms of why create a universe where pain exists. But here's another objection I would like to point out.
Okay.
All right. The free will argument allows the toleration of evil in human beings. But when you're in heaven, can you do evil? And if you can't, do you have free will there? And if you do, then you can have free will without evil.
Right.
And if you can't, then are you even the same person? I mean, the problems that this poses are copious. And it's because, and I've made this comparison before rather flippantly, it's like a kid designing a Pokemon character that is just so overpowered. Like it's designing a character without any flaws whatsoever, and with all the powers that there could possibly be, but then not realizing the problems that come with that when you try and insert this character into a story or into a universe.
Right.
Because we've crafted this idea of a perfect paradise. Well, can people in that paradise do evil? If they can, well,
why couldn't it have been that? Why couldn't he have started it out that way?
Yeah, the principle applies when we come to this particular world where we inhabit, which is the only one we can truthfully say we know that we have. We certainly do have people doing evil. We can go with people have free will, that's fine, but then if we're going to go that far, do people have free will in heaven? And if they don't, well, I'm not sure how to even say why that's a bad thing. I mean, they don't have free will? Are they slaves? How's that work? I mean, there's a lot of problems that come in with this, and the more we pick it apart, the more we realize that this deity that is described as omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient cannot be all three of those things. And several of those are inherently paradoxical and can't exist anyway, but that's a whole other discussion.
Right. So let me address that. Let's start with let's say that within theism there is the idea of people have their souls in heaven, and they never do or can sin. That whatever can be said about their freedom, that's never the case. For whatever reason. Okay. And let's say that theists will hold that their freedom is not subverted. So it's not that the case that they don't have free will. There's some other missing element, just like the free will part was the missing element in the problem of evil to help theism maintain a plausibility. There's another element that's not averted to when it comes to dealing with the beatific vision, and that is, when you see God, suddenly any motivation to do evil is going to be gone, whether that is a subversion of free will or not. Then the question is, well, why doesn't God just give us the beatific vision straight up, right?
Yep.
Why? Okay, so why make it possible to ever do evil? Okay, so I'm gonna ask this first. Let's create a world where it was never possible to do evil. This is going to be the counterfactual. Because if it's a factual objection, there's a counterfactual that is coherent. It's not true. That if theism were true, this would be true. Okay? And so in this counterfactual, the world never had evil. God existed. God created the world. He's omni this, omni that, omni the other, and there's no evil. Okay? So, now, I want to find out how it is that there's no evil. Is it because people are prevented from forming evil intentions? Or is it because they can form them, but they're never allowed to carry them out?
That's an interesting question. And I think if we're going to talk about free will, then I would say that the ideal situation would be one in which we were an inherently peaceful species that could live cooperatively and didn't develop evil intentions in the first place. You could create a life form, an organism, with the ability to form its own individual intentions, and therefore it has free will. However, it lacks the mental components, the elements of the brain that are necessary for aggression and violence. For example, let me propose a hypothetical. We know, of course, that rape happens. You could create an organism incapable of rape that would be unable to do it if its sex organs would not function if the other party were unwilling, an unwilling participant.
Yeah.
Thus, that particular crime, that particular evil, would not be feasible. There's all kinds of ways you could go about this kind of thing and still have free will. The fact that we can form these hostile intentions and harmful intentions to one another is fine within atheism and agnosticism, because we understand that these are evolved characteristics. But if we are created beings, then we were created with this capacity, and therefore the creator cannot be all good.
Now, what I hear is that the answer that you want to say is however it would work out for God to make it, so that sometimes we wouldn't form the intentions, other times we wouldn't be able to carry them out, and there would be like a balance between the two, perhaps.
More or less. I mean, you could go with straight up, you can't form this intention at all, but have free will otherwise. No ability to even come up with the idea of stealing or raping or murdering. You just don't have those mental tools.
I would argue that the idea of freedom without the capacity to think of whatever is possible to think is probably logically inconsistent. It probably can't really work together. Those two ideas together. I think intuitively I find that impossible to make that work. So that they're mutually true. Where an agent is free, really meaningfully and morally free, but cannot conceive of evil actions.
But we have life like that. I mean, there's all kinds of herbivores that never even consider harming anything else. Now, they are not as intelligent as we are, but if you gave them a mind, they would have the same kind of free will to act that we do. They just wouldn't have the mental ability to come up with evil acts.
Well, if they have, let's say we give them rationality. Let's say we can inject them with it.
Okay, yeah.
Frankenstein's, needle, and give them the boost, and suddenly they're rational. Mm-hmm. Basically, giving them a soul, in effect, classically. I mean, a human soul, really, because they were, classically they already have a soul in the sense that they're alive, but not a rational soul. Mm-hmm. So we're giving them rational spirituality, almost. Mm-hmm. And I would say that once they have that capacity, that and the fact that they have their own interests in mind means that sometimes, whether they would, kill to eat or not, they would still form aggressive motivations against other agents that were competing for the same, goods, to some mutually desired thing. And so, eventually, a deity who has all of these agents to deal with is going to have cases where some of them want to attack each other. Mm-hmm. No matter how well he created a paradise, there's something logically necessary that about this situation when you have enough free agents. Mm-hmm. Eventually, you're going to have some that go head to head.
Conflict is inevitable, therefore evil is inevitable. Basically,
at least initially, there's a situation where either the conflict is inevitable, or God has to act in some way that really defeats and subverts freedom to the point where it makes whatever good that he was trying to get out of the agent impossible. It'd be like, so basically it's like, I'm conceding that there's some weakness to the way omnipotence might be classically.
It has to be redefined in order to remove the paradox. Because the very fact of having omnipotence would mean you don't have it. I mean, the classical redefinition of it is anything that is logically possible. Well,
right.
But it's logically possible to lie. I can lie, but God can't lie. Therefore, God is not omnipotent, even by the definition that is revised.
That is an interesting point.
Yeah, it's not my favorite area to go into, but I mean, when you talk about the characteristics and traits, if we assume that it is that we're going to talk about a being that might have these, and then we have to talk about the plausibility and the implications of what it would be for a being to have these, and then we start running into paradoxes and problems. It is logically possible for me to stack up enough rocks that I cannot lift it, but if a God can't do that, I mean, that's the classic argument. Can he create a rock so big that he can't lift it? Well, but I can stack up a number of rocks individually that I can manage, but that eventually I won't be able to.
Sure.
So we
can, right. You don't because you're not all powerful.
Right.
You can come up with things that you can't do.
Yes. I
mean, he's all powerful. There should be nothing that's the case. So therefore, that should be a limit.
Yes.
At some point, he's limited in that he can't do that.
Right.
So
even if you go by anything that's logically possible, then God is limited by logic, which is strange. Well, I don't know that Catholics have this belief, but in many Protestant denominations, their belief, in many of them anyway, is that God created the laws of logic. Therefore, God can break the laws of logic. I've never heard a Catholic make that argument. So.
Yeah, Catholics won't, because the laws of logic are inherent to being itself and the intelligibility of it. They're part of his nature, and his nature, being the way it is necessary, rather than it's not subject to his will.
I will point out that Thomas Aquinas said that God was beyond logic. I want to say that was in Summa Theologica, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've read those materials.
If you find that, please send that to me, because that would be a instance in Thomas. I'm not going to say that he never said that. Anyone who says Thomas never said that, I think they're ridiculous, because he wrote so much, and most of it's in Latin, translated stuff.
Yes, and I can't read Latin, so I mean, it may have been a consequence of translation. It might have been Augustine. It was either Augustine or Aquinas. They kind of run. I never remember authors. They kind of run together after a while.
Yeah,
but it was one. I'm pretty sure it was one of those two, and I'm thinking it was Aquinas. Now, what he was referring to in that context, whether it was nature or good or evil, I again, it's been so long I don't recall. But when we're talking about a deity and that is bound by logic, then it is necessarily not omnipotent. Okay. But we could say that instead of being omnipotent, that this is just a really powerful being. And we're not worse off with that. You actually now have a deity that is coherent. You could even say it's the most powerful thing in the universe, or multiverse, in all of existence. And you have a coherent being. Right. I hate to say it, but honestly, a lot of the time it seems like, going back to that Pokemon example, we want to have this thing that is everything. And I just don't see the need for that. That's a weakness in doctrine, in my view.
Now, what I would say is that the doctrine of divine omnipotence, which has been held pretty much uniformly, has not been held always with consistency. Sometimes people hold to a kind of omnipotence that says the laws of logic are no barrier to God, to the will of God getting whatever He wants done, and others would say no, the laws of logic are just basically how we can speak intelligibly about things. And so if you try to affirm a logical contradiction, then put the words "God can" in front of it, you're not really saying anything sensible. You're just playing a little game with words. Yeah. But I would say that the proposition, the classical theistic proposition of omnipotence, was held there's enough antiquity to the notion that omnipotence only refers to God being able to do what's not logically impossible, because then you can't really say it. That this is not just some new theodicy, enriched, spin on omnipotence, but that it has at least many of the oldest thinkers who have upheld omnipotence have held this nuanced version, if you want to call it that. It's not really new, and that if this nuanced version is coherent, it's not necessarily incompatible with the fact of evil. But I would also say that the idea of a world that was created where no agent was ever allowed to either to think evil thoughts, or if they think of them, to carry them out, I would say that kind of world would not be a better world than this. It would actually be a dystopia. And the reason I say that is because if you imagine that world as a parallel universe to this one, then you take some agents from that one and put them in this one. Would you trust them?
So, like, if I were to take a couple of evil people from this world and drop them into a world where none of that was possible, that's a tough call. I'm not sure. It kind of depends on it kind of depends on what people we're talking about. I mean, if we're talking about dropping evil people over there, I mean, can you ever trust evil people?
I'm talking about taking the people who've never done anything wrong, because either they could never conceive of it, or they were never allowed to carry them out, and then bring them over to here in this world with us sinners.
Oh. How far? Well, I don't. That's an interesting notion. I don't know how that would play out. I mean, there have been concepts about that kind of thing. Like, have you ever seen The Invention of the Lie?
Yes.
It was actually a comedy. The first guy to develop the ability to lie.
Who was the headline of that? He was a little fudgier back then.
Yeah,
than he is.
I don't recall his name either.
British guy.
Yeah, good movie, really entertaining. But he
invented theism.
That's right. I'd forgotten that. He invented theism. It's interesting how many biblical references you can find through film when you start looking. But yeah, this was very overt and very clear, and he invented theism. Now, personally, I'm inclined to think that theism did not begin with a lie, but rather with a lack of understanding. But it could be, and that's an interesting notion. He invents theism, and it makes a lot of people generally happier, which is, I'll give him credit for trying to balance that promotion of sorts out, or that perspective out in some way. But we kind of drifted away. But when we come back to the notion of the problem of evil, I don't see that it's resolvable from a theistic perspective, because even if you argue that it's necessary here on Earth, if it's necessary, if evil is necessarily tolerated or necessary in order to have free will, then we're immediately either removing free will from heaven, or we're saying that God just happened to create it here, and here is the only place where it was required. In which case, why bother to create here? Why not just keep everybody there where we're better off? And bearing in mind, there's also limits on free will, and I don't mean the kind of social limits where there's laws. We are limited necessarily in what we can believe. I cannot choose to believe that there is a God, and I cannot choose to believe that Jesus came to save me. I cannot choose to believe that Santa Claus is real, and I cannot choose to believe that Allah revealed himself through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad in a cave. I can't just decide what to believe. I am necessarily limited by the information that is provided to me. So free will always has its limits. Unless I'm willing to lie to myself enough to convince myself of something, which some people do.
Sure.
But
yes,
there's limits on this. I mean, if that can be limited, then the notion that free will in terms of what evil actions are acceptable can't be limited. I just don't buy that. I see no reason why a deity cannot help a victim and respect the victim's free will instead of, from an objective standpoint, protecting the free will of the villain. Now, the argument that I hear most often is that, well, God's going to punish the villain later. They're going to face judgment. But from where I'm sitting, that's not an improvement. The victim was still victimized. They still suffered all that pain. They still suffered the consequences. If they were murdered and the victimizer repents, depending on the religion, and they choose the right religion to repent to, then they can get in and hang out with the victim. But then if the victim abandons their beliefs or chooses the wrong set of beliefs as a result, then the villain can get in, but the victim can't. And then, well, depending on which doctrine you go with, I mean, what's the afterlife? So we're dealing with concepts of justice and free will that necessarily remove some traits from a deity if we want to argue that it exists at all. I know I've kind of gone on longer than I meant there, but your turn.
Okay.
It's almost 4:40. I know you were talking about going to mass. But...
I'm gonna try and go for at least another 5 minutes or so and see what happens.
All right.
So I'm gonna present you the possible scenario, and you can let me know how plausible this sounds to you. Okay. So, in this idea that I'm presenting, evil had to be allowed temporarily, not done, but it would be up to the free agents that God created whether there would be any evil. It would be practically inevitable because of the problem I just pointed out, that there's always going to be, a conflict over, oh, I want this and you want that. So, but it wouldn't be logically inevitable. It would just be a practical inevitability that there would be a situation where if it was going to happen, God might have to permit it. But that is not so much, in this view, incompatible with theism, unless that situation, that scenario, is extended out forever. If there's no end to that, then I think I have to agree that I would have to concede that God, as described by classical theism, seems like a false description. If that's all that there is, forever, okay, then there's no remedy for it. Then there's really no remedy for evil, ultimately. It's just a matter of, here's a certain degree of evil that we always have to live with eternally, forever, okay? And I think theism doesn't grant that, doesn't concede that. It's saying there's an eventual, total remedy where eventually there's a tourniquet is applied, and the bleeding stops, and eventually there's no more evil after that. Now your position is, why did it have to be allowed at all? And the theistic response is, that maximal good that could not be attained without a situation of a sufficient freedom that allowed for evil, as long as there was an end point. At some point it stops, which we're just not there yet.
Well, that's an interesting view. I think that still removes the ability of this thing to be necessarily omnipotent, because
absolutely omni-everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We've got to remove some of the traits that are traditionally applied in order to grant that this deity can't do some of the things that we would choose to do. But here we're still stuck with individual circumstances where this deity is literally in the room, assuming omnipresence, is in the room with an innocent victim and a evil victimizer, and is choosing, if we assume that it can choose, that it is choosing not to act.
Right.
Now, with any intelligent agent such as you or I, were we in the room and we were to allow this villainous act to go forward, we would be rightly lampooned as villains ourselves, as enablers. Which begs the question is, why should we make an exception for a deity that literally has the power to stop any particular action? He could give, for example, a beatific vision right there and interrupt the guy and give him a vision that tells him not to do this kind of thing, to knock it off, to behave himself. doesn't even have to harm anyone, doesn't even have to steal his free will, just has to give him an immediate recognition that what he's doing is something he should not do. And this does not happen. And the evil goes forward, and the evil happens. And if we argue that it is necessary, then we're also arguing that this deity is bound by the limitations of his own creations. And I think that makes this worse, not better.
Well, I'm going to say this, that what would rightly be held against us, because we're in that room, no one would say, well, no one would say, okay, you allowed that, and you're also bad because of all the other things that happened everywhere.
Granted, but
whereas God is in every room.
Yes.
And what he's done we're only thinking about and able to consider a limited set of data, the data about what happened, but we don't have any notion of what counterfactuals there are that are the result of divine activity. So we necessarily have a limited set of data.
We don't know the battle plan, is what you're saying,
right?
Basically. Yes. Now, that's an argument. You can say, well, we don't know the battle plan. Maybe there's a larger vision for this in the long term. But that's an argument that has no potential answer, because no matter what set of evils that there is, you can always say, well, it's part of the plan. Well, to me, that it doesn't look like a plan. It just looks like a bunch of stuff that happens that is genuinely bad for people's health. Now, people's health, happiness, and well-being, which runs counterfactual to a being that is omnibenevolent, omnipresent, omniscient. He can't think of a better way to do these things. He's stuck with a limited, I've got to make some sacrifices kind of view that is no better than a human general or a human commander. It just doesn't jive, if you'll pardon the slang.
It doesn't. It puts theism in a position where it has to a theist has to accept certain facts as they are, and accept that certain things are if they believe that God exists, they have to accept that certain things are compatible with the existence of God, that no one would rather they were.
Yeah.
No one would prefer this.
And that is my primary problem. It requires people to accept a non-answer that can never be demonstrated to be true or false. Right. If we annihilated our entire species tomorrow, the last person standing could say it's all part of the plan, and we're still no closer. Maybe the plan is for in 1 billion years an alien race to show up, find our civilization, and find a cure to some other disease, and we're not that important in the long run anyway. There's no answer to that. No matter what happens, we can always say it's part of the plan. Which to me, that I know you would never apply this as a dodge, but that is what it comes down to. It runs counterfactual to our observations, and it doesn't change the fact that all these things that do happen, all this evil that does happen, is bad for the people who suffer it.
Yeah.
So I don't think the problem of evil can ever be adequately answered by any theism version that proposes a omnibenevolent deity or an omnipotent deity in any sense that omnipotence can reasonably be applied. I mean, omniscience is another argument entirely, but I think it reasonably strips away all three of the primary characteristics of the God of classical monotheism. We can't make this argument against, say, Thor or Odin or any deity that doesn't have ultimate power for everything.
At least it would require a theist who wants to maintain those descriptives to adjust the conception of them.
Yes.
But I think that can be done coherently.
Yes, you certainly could adjust. The definitions can be adjusted to make a coherent deity. But I will point out that that at least with the two great monotheisms, or three if we want to include Judaism, regardless of its small size, none of those three have really expressed a desire to do that. And it has left a very incoherent deity whose existence does not square with our observations of reality, and it requires us to resort to non-answers or things that can be said infinitely so no matter what happens. So I think it's very weak in that regard. So
I just got a little bit more time.
I hope I'm not keeping you from Mass.
I'm playing hooky on my obligation, so I'll have to repent of that later. So I want to. That was a bunch of stuff, and it was all good. So, and now I want to get some stuff on the record myself.
All right.
I like to go to present counterfactuals because these kinds of thought experiments are good for helping to at least pair off the BS of what we're thinking and the ideas that we have. Okay, so I think of two other possible worlds. We have this one, the actual world, and now I'm thinking of two possible worlds, two very different possible worlds. One I call Dystopia X, okay? And in Dystopia X, it's just the worst human world you can imagine. And it's not because there are so few people; it's because part of it has to do with there are so many. In Dystopia X, there's this elite that controls the vast, unwashed humanity, and there's many, many more people, and everybody suffers constantly. I mean, if you saw someone from this world, they would have very few teeth, bed sores all over their body. They would differ only in degree of coverage, and their lives are constant pain. Okay. And it's just the worst kind of life you can imagine, and it just goes on and on and on. And in Dystopia X, you have theists and you have atheists. The theists are grateful for every breath in this lousy world that they live in, and every day that they wake up, they consider a gift. And of course, you have atheists who are like, "Well, this world is horrible, and how can you be grateful for it? And look at all of this evil." If you took atheists from Dystopia X to here, this world would be a paradise in comparison. And they would
countries
probably
like
have
that now.
right, yeah, and they would probably have less sympathy with the atheists here than you would think, because they'd be like, you folks are complaining. You have no idea how good you have it here. Now the other world is, we can call it, I want to call it a utopia with no letter designation. That's a longer name because he would write it out with all those words. In this utopia, nobody has ever felt any discomfort or pain, or been victimized by any moral evil by anyone ever. But until it's not really a utopia, because that's only true hitherto, up till now. And now, today, people have been undergoing pain. There's some stubbed toes, a few skinned knees, some minor headaches, and one migraine. And these people they're all ready to become atheists now, because none of them understand how any of this is compatible with the existence of a good God. They're just these are utter calamities, and some of them are saying, well, even one of these is bad enough, and others are saying, well, it didn't have to be this many. It's been happening all day, And so when I have these two scenarios in mind, I then say, well, when it comes to the problem of evil, a lot of it has to do with degree and what we're used to, and what it amounts to is really an ad misericordiam fallacy, because and that's why we strongly, those who want to explore this issue, like to use the pedophilia example. It's the most obvious.
Sure,
but
it's one of many particularly powerful
rhetorically, because it makes us feel bad. It makes us feel pity. So there's a mixture of some fallacious stuff going on along with the logic of the argument.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily fallacious. We are empathic beings who are evolved to feel sympathy and empathy and pity for those who are in agony. I don't see that emotion is automatically fallacious. It can be manipulative, and one could make the argument that I was being a wee bit manipulative in choosing an emotionally laden position. But this is also something that actually happens, and happens at a very large scale. So the position is logical, and I simply used a emotion-laden example to highlight the power of the position. So,
Okay.
I would argue that just means I was making a strong argument.
Okay.
So, but you're
I
right.
think it's
That,
fair.
that's in those two,
powerful.
in those two different
Perspective.
worlds. That's an interesting perspective. Take an atheist from the terrible world, bring him to this one, and it's like, what are you complaining about? And then you have a basically ideal world where the first wrong thing to go awry, and people are like, oh no, that must mean there's no God. Well, when speaking of hypothetical worlds, we can have people react however they want. But really, the problem of evil doesn't relate to just like, okay, a medical condition that happens. Although migraines are terrible. My mother suffers from those, and it can keep you in bed all day. It can keep you in horrible agony. Why invent that? Why invent bone cancer? Why give bone cancer to children when we start going through these things just in nature that don't even have anything to do with independent, intelligent agents like us? We can ask, well, what's the point of this? How can you be good and create this? How can you be good and inflict this on people who don't deserve it? Why is it that these rich, powerful dictators die old and happy and in their beds while their victims suffer in the millions? There's all kinds of ways you can go with this. So when we talk about hypothetical worlds, how people would react is basically how we decide they react. If these people in this other world have the innate capacity to feel pain, but have never done so, they would necessarily see it as a bad thing. But if it goes on, then they will adapt to it. They will become used to it, because we're still assuming these are basically people like you and I. We are also accustomed to this world, to the difficulties that it has. But neither one of those, none of these three worlds, changes the inherent issue of where that's coming from and why create a situation where it exists. And none of it really would change, even in the world where everything has been going right somehow for hundreds of thousands of years. It wouldn't change the central issue of why should this exist. Now, I wouldn't necessarily take it to, well, no one in the universe should ever feel any pain under any conditions. I certainly inflicted some on myself earlier when I went for a run to get myself back into shape. I'm still a little sore from that. I don't think we need a world where certainly nothing can happen, but I certainly think the problem of evil, when we're talking about independent agents who are the strong taking advantage of the weak, grown men and women abusing or killing children, or all these other things, that certainly is something where, if there is an intelligent, invisible agency that's present when this is happening and it does nothing, then it loses the right to be called even good, let alone omnibenevolent or all good, just by doing nothing. And the argument that it's part of a larger plan that we can't see the end goal of, like when a general, like when someone, like when the Normandy happened and the general ordered the soldiers onto the shore to storm the beaches as part of a larger plan that nobody going ashore actually knew. They at least knew there was an end goal, defeat the Nazis, but they didn't know what was going to follow what, and none of them wanted to die. We end up creating a God that is no better than a human, which is basically all, kind of explains a lot about the way people see God. It has all the problems of humans. We try and strip them away, and we end up making them worse.
Well, I'm going to do something that might amount to conceding the whole issue to you. I don't know yet.
Well, I'll leave that to our viewers on that.
Right.
This is going to go up on my YouTube channel eventually, and I'll get you a copy of it, or you can just pull it down from there.
Great, that'd be cool. I'm going to tell you about me and about how I hold to those positions instead of just being abstract about what theists might think. I want to talk about me. Okay, and it might wind up being a total concession to your view, even though I don't hold your view. You might have to say, well, yeah, you don't hold my view, but your view you might as well just change your mind if that's what you think. Well, we'll say. Okay, I hold to a view of God that some might consider heretical.
Huh.
And I don't really know if it is.
I love heresy. Please go on.
In my view, God, in order to, I hold the view, and this is a classical view, that God created, I believe in God creating ex nihilo, and I believe in God creating freely rather than out of necessity. That's a very classical Catholic conception that was formulated pretty tightly in the First Vatican Council. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that view has certain consequences that I think many, traditionalist Catholics don't avert to. They try to avoid them logically. They try to kind of have their cake and eat it when it comes to certain things, and try to hold to this omni-everything God in a very absolute sense. But they're also holding to God having created freely rather than out of necessity and out of nothing, and that He creates free agents. And I think that when you have a God who creates free agents, and that is outside time, is eternal, so there's no before or after for God. It's all happening at once. It's some things that He does out of necessity, that is, exist, and exist the way He exists. And other things that He does freely, that is, He spends His energy creatively, to make other beings to be. I think that when you have an infinite being doing that, He has to, I think, put some limits on His own activity and on His own, on some of those omnis in the way He expresses them. So to create beings with freedom, He doesn't necessarily know beforehand. He has to not necessarily know beforehand how they're going to do, what they would do. Yeah. He can know maybe some general things, based on, I'm going to create a person with a certain disposition, but He's creating all of them at once, in all of time, and not just the ones that existed already. All of the agents that He's creating of all time, the ones that exist in our future, the ones that exist in our past, and the ones that exist now, He's creating all at once. And so He has to limit His own foreknowledge in order to create free agents, and He has to limit some of what He does to give them room to act freely. So He has to kind of un-omni Himself with relation to creation, not in His own abilities. He doesn't limit His own abilities, His own inferior nature, but He would necessarily have to limit the way He acts in relation to those creatures, just to give them room to exist. The Kabbalists have a sort of word picture for this. They call it Zimzum, where God, with the Ein Sof, God withdraws in order to give space to the universe and to free agents to be. And that's the view that I hold. So it might be somewhat heretical, but it means that God, it might be omni-everything within Himself, but in relation to creation, He sort of has to tie His hands somewhat. And then that would make sense out of because there's another problem with theism, and that's the problem of prayer, which is probably also worth another thing in itself. Why does God want us to even ask for things? Why doesn't He have a plan? And I would say the God, as an omni-everything, is giving us room to be, room to breathe, in effect, and saying there are some things I'm only going to give you if you ask for them. I want you to ask for them. I want to give them to you. But I can't if you don't, because I've tied my hand somewhere, and I need you to untie my hand. So some of the evil that God allows, He allows and doesn't want to have to. But it's because of the limitation that our freedom places upon Him. And He would like us to give Him more room to act. But He has to hold up His hand like this somewhat, and then wait for us to ask for Him to help.
This is rather,
and He doesn't always help when He's asked, because He's got other things to think of and the end view in mind. He's got all of it going on at once.
This is very similar, not identical, but very similar to the deistic argument of the God that creates, like the watchmaker, the divine clockmaker created everything and then takes a step back, no more interference. Well, you don't argue for no more interference, right, but it's reasonably close. Wish we had more time to explore that.
Limited interference, right?
Yeah, sure. Then the question becomes, okay, well, how does He decide when to interfere? How would we know if He ever was or wasn't? How can when we objectively measure, for example, prayer, we find that it doesn't do anything. The Templeton Foundation, the Templeton Foundation measured this, and Hold on. Have you ever heard of Christian scientists?
Yeah,
I don't mean scientists who are Christians. I mean the
I know.
denomination.
First Church of Christ scientists, you mean?
Yeah, the one started by Mary Baker Eddy.
Right.
Yeah, they say that since God created everything and God is all good, nothing evil can exist. Sickness is, nothing bad can exist. Sickness, therefore, is bad. Since it's bad, can't exist. They don't do medicine. They do dentists, probably because Mary Baker Eddy's husband was a dentist, but they don't believe in. Yeah,
No, that.
yeah, her husband was a dentist. They allow dentistry.
You got a toothache, though.
Yeah, toothaches are allowed. Yeah, she was probably schizophrenic, but they treat illnesses by prayer and talking people out of believing that they're sick. They're convinced that it's a delusion.
Right.
Well, if prayer works, then we should see when we measure the health and well-being of a society that uses no medicine against a society that uses medicine, then there should be some sort of comparison between the two that's viable. But instead what we find is that they have a death rate 44 times higher than people who just use medicine, or people who use prayer and medicine, which is, to me, basic. When just prayer alone has that kind of failure rate, and it's only gone up as the efficacy of medicine has grown, that's what failure looks like.
Well, I don't think that medicine really needs to be held as in opposition to prayer. I see medicine as
it's not in opposition. I'm just saying that it's when you rely on prayer, and the population that's relying on prayer is dying 44 times more often. That's what this doesn't work looks like. If that's not what failure looks like, I don't know what it is.
Look, let's say you have a society where where people all they have is toothbrush and toothpaste.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and they have a lot of dental problems compared to the society that, or societies where, say, they don't brush their teeth but they have dentists, and societies that have both, general dental hygiene and dentists. That wouldn't mean that toothbrush and toothpaste don't work at all. It just means that some things, are not meant to be done, by themselves. I mean, I don't see any reason why someone who believes that prayer works has to say that in order for prayer to work, it should be done in isolation.
Well, it wouldn't have to be done in isolation. But if you take someone who does nothing but use medicine and someone who does nothing but pray, which one do we really expect to outlive the other, all other things being equal? The people who don't use vaccinations get sick more. The populations that don't use vaccinations, often very heavily religious, and often as a result have outbreaks, despite relying on prayer. Now, I personally don't think that you can just that they have to necessarily throw away prayer. But if we're going to look at something that empirically works, medicine, and the assertion is that prayer works, it should at least work better than nothing. And
well, what's nothing? And nothing isn't medicine. Nothing would be no prayer and no medicine.
Exactly. If someone only uses medicine and never prayer, then the prayer is not there. If someone doesn't use either medicine or prayer,
I think when you're using medicine, you're cheaty, bringing in previously answered prayers. What you really need to compare no prayer to is prayer and no prayer. You need to compare no prayer and no medicine to prayer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
so there's no ethical way to test no medicine, sadly. But when we do a comparison between people who are prayed for and get a placebo versus initial treatments and whatnot, people who are prayed for, people who are not, the Templeton study ended up showing people who were prayed for doing worse because they psyched themselves out. It's like, wow, it's really bad, I have to be prayed for. When we measure miracle sites, statistically speaking, for example, such as Lourdes, we find no statistical variation in terms of recovery rates.
Compared to that to what?
Well, when you compare that to people who just never went.
Wait, all the people in the world who never went?
Well, you can't do a statistical study with everyone in the world, but when you compare the rates of recovery, people who have gone against people who have not gone, and you come up with...
Are you doing exactly that then? Everybody who never went?
You could do, say, what's a statistical relevant size? I want to say it's like 3,000 people, roughly. If you take 3,000 people who go and 3,000 people who don't, and you don't come up with a statistical variation, then that's what not working looks like. If that's not what failure looks like, please tell me what would show that something doesn't work.
If that can be shown, I will look that up.
Yeah, there was a study done on certain miracle sites. Lourdes was one of them. There have been, I'm pretty sure there have been others, but when you're
if that can be shown,
we
that you have any 3,000 people whatsoever, and how they happen to recover from whatever. Yeah. And then you have the 3,000 people, or whatever it is, whatever number that went to this miracle site, and they come out identical. Then, I think that you've shown that there's nothing very special about that site.
Yeah, you have there's a certain statistical variation that's allowed. I want to say it's 1 to 3%. It allows for a statistical variation. It's like when you flip a coin, 51% of the time, it's still just a coin flip. It's still basically 50-50. I think statistically speaking, heads comes up like 1% more due to some variation in the weight of the face of the coin, something like that. Yeah. But when you're measuring whether something works or not, and one has overwhelming success, that only grows with time as we develop, say, better and better medicine. But prayer is the same as it ever was. I mean, look at the Black Death. People all over Europe were believers and prayed, and yet still 2/3 of the continent died.
Right.
Less over time because more people developed immunities. Those with natural immunities diffused their populations into the genome of the overall population, so you had progressively fewer dying off. But that is something we can measure empirically through science, and we understand how that works. It wasn't...
Yeah, the prayer thing, we would have to measure against the counterfactual, say, of a Black Death filled with, afflicting a nation where nobody was religious. I don't think that we have that data available. If we did, then we'd really have something. I know for a fact that when it comes to the issue of prayer, it's a mixed bag, and that there have been studies that show good, very positive correlation, and others that show nothing, and others that show a negative correlation. And I think the negative correlation is just as interesting as the positive one, because you shouldn't have any.
I don't know of any studies that have showed any consistently positive one beyond the statistical variations that one would expect in variable studies. That being said, again, we're looking at medicine empirically works because we have a measurable recovery rate.
Right.
But then if we look at a society where everybody is religious and nobody uses medicine, and we see a death rate 44 times higher, what does failure look like if not that? I mean, I don't know. If that's not failure, if that's not, this doesn't work.
You're comparing two different things.
We'll think about homeopathy. Are you familiar with homeopathy?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't use it, but
I don't either. But the same structure, aside from the aspects of chemistry where make homeopathy obviously false, but when it's compared to actual implementation and use, prayer doesn't outperform homeopathy, and we have no problem saying that homeopathy doesn't work. For the same reason, we can say certain medicines work. Now, we cannot ever. There is no point at which we could say no prayers anywhere have ever been answered. For example, some people recover from illnesses that, statistically speaking, most people die of. Doctors have made wrong diagnoses and so on and so forth. But when we look at our statistical studies, when we measure populations and their health and what they do versus what others do, we can see which works better. And if we did away with all prayers, if nobody prayed for anything for a year, I don't think that our death rates would change unless all of those people who just prayed started using medicine, in which case we'd see an increase in survival.
I think every time that you talk about prayer and then you throw in medicine and saying if you use prayer, you can't really use medicine because then it's not right.
Well, you can do both, but I'm just saying prayer is the equivalent of nothing.
Yeah, well, I know that the empirical evidence is a mixed bag, and it's not uniformly negative, and it doesn't uniformly show nothing. It's those who want to deny that prayer does anything have results that support their issue, support their conclusion, but there are also positive ones that they.
I will concede. I don't know of any positive correlations. I will concede that maybe there have been, and I just have not seen them. But when we look at the historical evidence, the rates of infection and death rates versus when people were chiefly reliant on prayer, the infections of the New World that decimated almost 100 million people between North and South America, the death rates of the Black Death and all the illnesses that plagued Europe, and all of the existence of smallpox and all the decimation that it wrought for countless generations. We have all this history before modern medicine, where people of every different faith sought the solace of their gods, deities, spirits, ancestors, demons, whatever it is that they believed. They sought to influence the spiritual realm to heal them, and entire populations were wiped out. We develop modern medicine, we develop cures that empirically work, and we see massive extensions in human lifespan and in survival. But in those societies that reject all of that in favor of prayer, then it's just like there's no modern medicine.
I see what I'm saying is, I think that if from a theistic perspective, the amazing advances that have been made in the field of medicine are not divorced from the action of a deity that was initiated by, say, the prayer of a creature.
Oh, yes.
We're all smuggling in results of prayer.
My mother would actually hold to that view that medicines are answered prayers. That people prayed for medicines and God helped people invent them. What that calls to mind to me, there's a photo that was popular a while ago. You've probably seen it. It has Jesus standing behind a surgeon, holding the surgeon's hands and guiding his actions. Well, I think it was Aaron Ra, or is it Aaron? Aaron Ra. There we go. I want to get his name right. He said, suppose you remove Jesus from that picture. The surgeon still has all the same experience, all the same knowledge, all the same countless hours of study and examination, and is working as an intern under, or I forget what the term is when you're working under another doctor. Do you remember what the term is? You know what I'm talking about, right? You work under another doctor for a while. I can't remember the word, but where you're working under another doctor and learning along the way. I can't remember. It's flown my mind. But where you're doing all of that, spending year after year after year preparing to go do that surgery, if you remove Jesus from the picture, what changes? The doctor still has all that same ability. The result would be the same either way, as near as we can tell, because we know what life was like before those doctors had that knowledge.
Yeah, but we don't, from the theistic perspective, is that Jesus is never quite out of that picture with all those good things.
Yes, that is the theistic perspective, which is, as a Muslim once said, I prayed to God and God didn't heal my daughter, and then I gave her the medicine and then God healed her. The theistic perspective to where I'm sitting is tacked on. It's like if we asserted that gravity wasn't just the result of displacement in space-time and the mass and density of objects drawing closer together. Rather, there was also these invisible agents that were holding us to the ground. Well, we understand it. We still have the same thing that we can empirically measure. To me, most of theism is tacked on to knowledge of nature and understanding. We cannot show that no prayer was ever answered. But we can look at life when it was just prayer versus life when now we have medicine. And when we compare two societies where they have those different tacks, we can see which one is clearly healthier, happier, longer lived. People in many secular societies, I mean, there's still lots of religious people and they still pray. But, when you have a population that's largely, non-believers, you get the same results as if there was, no one praying at all. I was born with a heart defect. In fact, if memory serves, the story I was told when I was young was that I was the first person ever to have this surgery. It was a hole in my left ventricle, and the doctor repaired the hole. Before my birth, there was a 100% fatality rate. Everybody who had this defect died. They froze my body in ice shortly after I was born. I was dying of this condition, and then they froze my body in ice and did the surgery. That slowed the blood flow down so they could do it so I'd stay alive long enough for them to fix the problem. And I lived, and here I am. But before my birth, before 1978, everybody who had this died. Where was prayer then? And we can look at lots of different conditions and find this. Where the prayers were certainly there, I'm sure you probably have large numbers of ancestors who had lots of children who most of those children died off of various diseases. My great-grandfather had multiple siblings. He was the only survivor. His mother had 4 or 5 children. 3 of them died before the age of 12, 2 of them before the age of 5. He survived. And that's true for almost everybody. We're the children of survivors. But
right.
all these people prayed. And what were the results?
Right.
Still 5 out of 7 died.
Now, let me process this for a second. So, I think your point is that God is omni whatever or something. He's something, okay? He's powerful at least, right? Mm-hmm. So why wasn't prayer more effective, than it was?
Sure. From a hypothetical perspective, if this deity exists, I mean, why isn't prayer yielding different results than nothing?
Okay, all right. I don't think that it can be established that it's yielding the same results as nothing, because, as I've said, in order to make the case, you're comparing, praying societies, say, without medicine to non-praying societies with it, but you're not comparing praying society without medicine to praying society without medicine.
I'm sorry. Can you say that? Can you say that? Can you say? You mean
not praying?
A society that does both,
where they do pray inside without medicine, where they don't pray, and that would be the data set you really need to make that case. Otherwise, you don't have data set.
We could argue that data set exists. When you look at highly atheistic societies, how successful is medicine? Atheists, generally, we don't do much in the way of praying. Right. So if prayer is a useful complementary thing that yields results that are in some way empirical, and results are by definition empirical, then we should see highly religious society that has medicine and prayer, such as the United States.
Right.
We should be able to compare it to a highly atheistic society where most people are not praying, like Japan or certain countries in Europe. I forget which one is most atheistic. I want to say it's like the Netherlands or something.
Praying.
Sorry?
In Japan, they're not theistic in the same sense that, say, Christians are, but I know that there's a very strong Buddhist current, and the Japanese Buddhism is very interesting because it's not an atheistic Buddhism. They hold to trans-historical cosmic Buddhas that act like gods.
Yeah, well, there's a variable set of beliefs there, but when you look at societies where they don't pray for health,
sure.
I don't think if someone who is a Buddhist wants to, see this later and correct me, I don't believe that Buddhists pray for recovery. To them, it's all part of a cycle. So they wouldn't be asking the universe to heal them. So it's essentially, from a experimental point of view, it's the same as not having that belief, because they're not following through on something that a Muslim or a Christian or certain other beliefs might do. So when we compare societies that have a highly atheistic, God is not going to intervene on my behalf, or there is no God mindset, and compare it to a religious society where you have both, where you have medicine and prayer. And the United States is one of those. And we compare the well-being of both societies. We end up with a better result over there. on the other end. Now, a lot of that has to do with our system is worse. Our medical system is worse than theirs.
Arguably, that could be all.
Yeah, you could say that's. In fact, I would go so far as to say that's entirely the reason, is that their systems of medical care are better. But here again, what's the difference that prayer is making? If you can't say that it's making a difference, and we would,
again, we're having the issue of we don't really have, we only wish we had the data set. If we had two Swedens, one was religious and one that wasn't, and then compared their, the same medical system, then we'd have the data set.
Yeah.
Now, have you ever heard of the book Healing Words by Larry Dossey?
I can't say that I have.
Okay.
I might have heard that title. That sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm sure I've never read it.
He's got this little insert in there where he goes over some very interesting empirical data that showed a positive correlation with prayer, and he found what was most convincing to him, and it changed his practice. It made him incorporate prayer into, he's a medical doctor, and it made him incorporate prayer into his practice, was that prayer worked even when the agents could not possibly care that they were praying for because they were bacteria. Okay? And he found that the most effective prayers in the study were the ones that were not prayers for specific outcomes, but for general "Thy will be done" type prayers. So, whereas in the studies where it shows, negative or at least no correlation, a lot of times the controls that were placed upon the people doing the praying, you must pray for this, you can't pray for that, and and this by people who don't even know the first thing about what prayer is, they don't have a relationship with God, and they don't know what they're talking about. And then suddenly they have there's no correlation, there's no this and that. Yeah, but your study stunk. Okay, and the controls that you were laying on it, these are not natural things that people who pray do.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm not familiar with that particular text. I would have to take a look at it, and I'd have to look at the methodology of the study and what was determined in the peer review behind it. I can't argue on something I have never seen. Yeah. But when we come back to, how well did prayer work before medicine? Well, now we have medicine. We still have prayer, and people are surviving more often. How much of that can we attribute to prayer? Well,
right.
I don't think we can attribute any of it, but obviously, as an atheist,
right?
I
think that as a theist, I don't have to concede that data.
You don't. Well, yes, as someone who has this particular belief, for you, it's like, well, we don't know, and that's a perfectly reasonable standpoint to come from. Is you don't know. Right. But to me, comparing the past to the present and seeing how it works out, to me, it looks like failure. It looks like it doesn't work. It looks like there's no contribution. And maybe there is a placebo effect that favorably impacts some people, but I mean that placebo effects tend to be they work regardless. It's like the placebo effect studies on acupuncture, but that's a whole other subject.
Yeah. It would be easy to get we've been sidetracked a couple of times.
Yeah,
but I think
sure. Been fun though.
These are good sidetracks, and but it's still easy to get sidetracked into cool other things.
Yeah,
and I think
it really is. Yeah.
Which means it's probably worthwhile to do stuff like to have some more of these, because I think it's at least fun. I don't know. I don't feel like I won. This. So
Well, the goal of any debate or discussion is progress rather than victory. And
right.
I hope that people watch
I
this
did
and
have
gain something from it.
I don't know if we beating the dead horse, but it was very interesting to exchange the ideas, and whatever people get out of it, I think it could be a good.
If nothing else, I think if it goes on to a couple of the groups that we have in common, maybe some positive lessons on exchange might be drawn from this.
That if nothing else happens, that would be a great thing.
Yes. Yeah. So. What might be fun. I don't know about your relationship with your church or whatnot, but this might be an interesting video to show some of your fellow churchgoers and see what their take is on this. So
here's why I couldn't make it last Sunday.
Yeah. Well, it was time well spent as far as I'm concerned. It was nice talking to you. We will set something up like this again for future discussion, maybe problem of good or subject prayer and
more
its
on-
efficacy, or any of the many problems and issues that come up. This was time well spent. So,
Okay,
all
excellent.
right. Thanks for being on. All right.
Thank you, Robert.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye.